Good morning and welcome to the Sustainable Farming Association's webinar on silvopasture in the Midwest. Today's presenters are Gary Wyatt and Keeley. My name is Tyler Carlson and I am the SFA's Silvopasture and Agroforestry lead. I thank you for your interest in silvopasture and for tuning into this webinar. And I have a short introduction for those of you who were here on Tuesday with our last webinar. This will be a repeat. This webinar is being recorded as part of a four-part series on silvopasture and is made possible by a North Central SARE grant. The SFA is coordinating a professional development program to educate agriculture and conservation professionals on silvopasture and oak savanna restoration. Technical assistance is provided by the University of Minnesota Extension and the Savanna Institute. So what exactly is silvopasture and why is the SFA interested in this work? Silvopasture is a practice that integrates livestock on the landscape and is a component of the SFA's overall soil health programming. Silvopasture is the intentional management of timber, forage, and livestock on the same acres. By utilizing managed grazing, 21st century fence and water infrastructure, and sound timber management, we can improve profit and ecological function on the 660,000 plus acres of grazed woodlands in Minnesota. So again, with that, our presenters today are Gary Wyatt, Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension, and Keeley, Co-Executive Director with the Savanna Institute. And I will stop my screen here. And one last thing, as Gary cues up his presentation, to clarify, at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a Q&A box as well as a chat box. So as the day is going on, you can use the Q&A box to type in questions that will be addressed to the presenters during the Q&A at the end of the presentations. And if you wish to chat amongst yourselves and with the panelists, use the chat box. But the Q&A is best used for questions to be directed to the panelists. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gary.
My name is Gary Wyatt. Thank you, Tyler, and thank you for Sustainable Farming Association for setting up these webinars. It's very good. My name again is Gary Wyatt, Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm in agroforestry. My specialization is agroforestry, invasive species, and bioenergy. I'm based out of our Mankato regional office. I live further west in Minnesota in the prairie zone of the state. And I've been working for the University of Minnesota Extension as a county extension educator for 20 years and for a regional extension educator for 16 years, so about 36 years of experience. So that's why the gray hairs exist. Here we go. Okay, so we want to start out with what is agroforestry, and silvopasture is one of the 5 agroforestry practices that we have in that term. Agroforestry is a long time historical type used practice over the years worldwide, and North America is no question. We've used these practices around the country. Forest farming, alley cropping, windbreaks, more popular in the Midwest, obviously, riparian forest buffers. So it's putting the right tree, right plant, and the right location for the right reason. So an outline today with Keeley from the Silvopasture or Savanna Institute. He's going to talk about some of the practices that he's been working with and some of the farms that he's been working with in the Midwest here. We're going to talk about what is silvopasture, why silvopasture, history of the U.S. and silvopasture, research, and where you can find research based on silvopasture in the United States and North America. Also establishing silvopasture systems, example of silvopasture practices, case studies, and resources. So what is silvopasture? Combining timber, livestock, and forage production on the same acreage. Tree shade management, forage productivity, livestock grazing, extensively managing these 3 operations, these 3 components of silvopasture. The trees provide long-term returns while livestock and forages generate an annual income. So historically, it seems like agriculture and forestry has not mixed, and agroforestry is certainly a practice that it uses working trees with agriculture. And a lot of universities still have a forestry department that does not like trees, and DNR Department of Natural Resources, forestry people do not like agriculture and woodlands and so forth. So that still exists in some locations. So, but I think the barriers have come down over the years. We're seeing the advantages of doing silvopasture and other agroforestry practices. So what silvopasture is not, it's not opening up your woods to livestock and just willy-nilly releasing livestock into the woodlands without management. We have a lot of non-managed, unmanaged woodland grazing going on in the country and around the world. And silvopasture is not that. It's not 2 or 3 trees in a pasture. It's highly managed forage, timber, and livestock. Here's an old publication on the right-hand side of your screen, actually from the University of Wisconsin, and probably in the 30s, I think this was developed. So don't put your cows in this picture. And that's been historically the way things have been done in the Midwest. So we need to manage our resources. It takes intentional, intensive, integrated management to prevent damage to the trees, provide good forage under the trees, prevent erosion and compaction around the trees, limit the spread of invasive species that we have today, and then plan for regeneration. So why silvopasture now? Well, it seems like partners are ready and promoting silvopasture. Also, farmers and landowners want to change their practices to be more sustainable grazing systems and more economical. In Minnesota, we have an opportunity of over 600,000 acres of unmanaged grazed woodlands. And now community farmers had a desire to improve the productivity of woodland grazing. Recognizing the decline of woodland is a practice that was unsustainable, and farmers are realizing that and willing to change their practices. There are many benefits to silvopasture: increasing soil health, food security, increasing food efficiency of livestock, shading the summer as we're seeing warmer summers and climate change, improved forest health, forest cover in woodlands, also ground cover and carbon storage and other ecosystem services to improve the environment that might come to be available for producers, and economic and social benefits. If we look at the historical map of this country and the livestock that was grown and raised and naturally occurred in the United States and North America, bison was our early grazers in pre-settlement era before the livestock came from Europe, cattle and sheep and so forth. So it's amazing that most of us think about the livestock or the bison. The first native bison in the country was maybe in the Great Plains. Their range actually was northern Canada to actually northern Mexico, and from east to west encompassed from New York to Idaho and Utah, and then also south to Louisiana and Georgia. So the range of bison in this country in North America was very vast. As we talk about the history of this country and the history of bison in the plains and in the oak savanna, we have to certainly talk about oak savanna region. As you see in the Midwest, the oak savanna region, it encompasses most of the Midwest, and from the Dakotas to Ohio and then south to Texas. And fire was a major contributor to regeneration of these landscapes, both woodlands and oak savannas and prairies, and either natively set by Native Americans or naturally set by thunderstorms or whatever. But fire was definitely a regeneration type tool, and grazing as well. So grazing under trees started before livestock entered the North American tourist trade and so forth by our early settlers. Bison was here. In 1950s, the southern pine species in the southern states were very popular and started growing plantations of pines as the industry started in that era. And as recently as 1998, the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri was established. And then a year after, in 1999, the National Agroforestry Center was established in Lincoln, Nebraska, promotes silvopasture and other agroforestry practices to universities, state forestry agencies, and USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. Around that time, too, Cornell University was a major leader in agroforestry practices and looking at northern hardwoods. So silvopasture is an acceptable practice in the Southeast and Northwest United States, and not widely accepted in the Midwest. But Midwestern farmers have and value trees in pastures and grazed woodlands. Some of the trees that were used are being used in the East and West and South. Certainly the East has oaks, black walnut, honey locust. In the South, they have various pines from longleaf, slash, loblolly pine, pecans, and eucalyptus. And then also in the West, very different types of trees that are being used, conifer trees, besides aspen, Douglas fir, pinyon juniper, ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine. So this study of Midwestern states regarding woodland pastures, I think was taking place in 2012. And you see here fewer than 1% of the farms reporting practicing silvopasture. They were basically unmanaged woodland grazing. And you see that up to 35% in Missouri, 15% Wisconsin, 25% in Minnesota, 30% Iowa, and Illinois even 15%. Another chart regarding this study and the statistics. So you look at the number of farms in pasture woodlands in the Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa, thousands, and just a vast number of farms that are raising livestock and pasturing in the woods. And then the acres are phenomenal, and you look at the acres. But look at the number of farms in agroforestry. Very few farms in practicing agroforestry practices. So we need to educate our producers a little bit more about the sustainable practices of agroforestry and silvopasture. So Midwestern trees that silvopasture could be adapted for. Woodlands certainly are native trees, whatever is out in your native woodlands. Oak, certainly there's a lot of different varieties of oak in the Midwest. Black walnut, hickory, black cherry, just to mention a few. Also, if you're planting trees, another design of silvopasture is planting trees in pasture and then raising them up for a timber product. Oak, black walnut, chestnut. There's a group of individuals and nurseries that are growing American chestnuts and trying to get that particular species back into marketable form. Also, you can consider shrubs between the trees as the trees are growing to canopy height. Certainly plantings underneath the trees can be developed. Hazelnut, elderberry, some of the edibles like black chokeberry. Some of our possible forages and grasses that we've been working with in Minnesota, warm season grasses, the natives, switchgrass, Canadian rye, wild rye, and then Virginia wild rye, some fescue, pea, and then the two clovers, purple prairie clover and white prairie clover. Cool season grasses, orchard grass is a shade tolerant grass, timothy, Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, creeping red fescue, red clover, and white clover are all good grasses to interseed into these landscapes. Just wanted to show a few slides regarding the NRCS agroforestry standards. So we look at the Midwest, several states in this particular map, and this is an outdated map, I believe. Only 2 practices are outlined in this particular map of 2 agroforestry practices that have standards with NRCS, and that has changed. But you look at this map, and actually we do have Minnesota now offers a standard for silvopasture, thanks to our leadership with our new state forester, Seeley Borndahl. And we thank you for that leadership, Seeley. And we think these other states will comply real soon. But having a standard practice that's offered for federal funding, equip dollars, et cetera, for silvopasture is very important to producers. We move into research in the United States regarding silvopasture. Most of the U.S. research on silvopasture has been done and conducted in the east, south, and western regions of the country. The most common results from research: geography, climate, culture, and markets affect silvopasture adoption and implementation. And the big key is the farmer's willingness to manage these 3 components: livestock, forages, and trees are needed for success. If we don't have a producer that's willing to do that, then it's not going to be successful. There are many different articles, journal articles, publications, university graduate student papers, etc., that are done on silvopasture. I'm just going to review a few here. Establishment of integrated timber, forage, and livestock pastoral systems in Southeast. This was out of the University of Florida. cattle distribution and behavior in southern pine and silvopasture versus open pasture. And this was in the Journal of Agroforestry Systems. Shade for improving cattle gains and rangeland use. And this was an ARS, or Agricultural Research Service, out of Oklahoma. The U.S. Forest Service has this general report on management of southern pine forests for cattle production. And then we have a graduate paper, a master's thesis on forage production and nutritive value of the temperate Appalachian silvopasture out of Virginia. So there's many research journals and resources for landowners and farmers to gather information. These journals, I'll just list a few here: Agroforestry Systems, Agricultural Systems, Association for Temperate Agroforestry, which farmers can belong to actually, and then Forest Ecology Management, Forest Policy and Economics, the U.S. Forest Service, and there are various land-grant universities in the 1862 provided land-grant universities to each state in the Union. 1890 is the Afro-American land-grant universities institutions, and then the 1994 is the Native American institutions. And so any of those and all of those do have some type of agroforestry journal or some type of paper that you can look up at those institutions. So I do recommend you look at your land-grant university in your state and neighboring states for information regarding studies on silvopasture. And also the nonprofits or the other grower groups like Savanna Institute has various publications and research operations and publications that are available for people. And then Sustainable Farming Association, as we're working through today, has various resources. And now we'll be talking about a network system too, working in the future. Various books are on the market. This was a 2018 publication. Andrew Gordon is from Canada, and I think some of these other people are from other countries, but they have other articles written inside these books by North American specialists. And this is an agroforestry publication, Agroforestry for Sustainable Agriculture. And I know we participated, actually our office participated in the windbreaks little chapter in that particular book. And then a recent book on silvopastures by Steve Gabriel. He's with the Cornell University Extension Service. And I haven't read that book, but certainly a good resource to look at and check out at your library or purchase. The Center for Agroforestry out of the University of Missouri is a very excellent resource, been established for many years, and has a good research base of their publications and past publications and what they're doing on their farms there in Missouri. And then they've gathered obviously other resources and videos of producers in their state that are doing silvopasture work. Don't forget the SARE program, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program for producers. And these will be open for farmers or landowners too, to get grants from the SARE organization on agroforestry grants. Kate McFarland is in charge of that out of the Lincoln office and the National Agroforestry Center. And do contact her for more information. But you can contact and learn more about what's been done with SARE research grants. And there's probably been a lot of silvopasture grants that farmers have done over the years. The USDA National Agroforestry Center, based out of Lincoln, Nebraska, as I mentioned before, is a very good resource for growers and extension educators and groups that want to talk about different agroforestry practices. They have a website on silvopasture and also very good publications and research information on silvopasture. So as we look at woodland grazing versus design plantation, there's two different components of how you can evolve your property into silvopasture. If you have woodland, then that's certainly an opportunity, woodland grazing. You're already established with trees and you're doing some thinning and maybe reseeding of some forage. That's on the left-hand side of the screen. Or you're designing a plantation where you're going to plant trees in a pasture or open pasture situation. The top slide there on the right is 4 cow calves in a small acreage in Minnesota that's starting a plantation of chestnut trees. And they're obviously very small. They're about 3 foot tall, but they're being protected by a hot wire between the cattle and those particular trees. And then down below to the right is a plantation planting in the south of the pines. One of the pine species that is very popular down there. And then obviously they're not fenced because they're too tall and they're not a problem for livestock anymore. So research in silvopasture, current research is demonstrating that managed grazing under tree canopies can benefit a grazing animal enterprise. Implementation of silvopasture practices should be considered in open pastures, increase animal productivity, and to generate additional value in timber or nut production. And this was taken from the publication down below there in 2004, the Hardwood Silvopasture Management in North America. I want to just talk about two grants that we had in Minnesota and have currently. We have our #1 grant that we did in 2012, and I think some of the growers will be on the next couple of webinars talking with your group with SFA. We had $190,000 research on 3 demonstration farms in the Brainerd, Minnesota area, central Minnesota. Documented cover and soil health, improved understory, improved tree health after select thinning through the different paddocks, and then also improved livestock health and summer gains. I have a few slides looking at that research. So you see a before picture and after picture in one of the locations, one of the sites. Trees managed in this particular location was red maple, red oak, bur oak, paper birch, and the quaking aspen. And we did have 3 locations that we monitored. And reseeded into these areas was Timothy, red clover, slender wheatgrass, fringe brome, and Virginia wild rye, which are all native except for the Timothy variety. So we looked at 2 years, 2014, 2015, open pasture, silvopasture, and woodlands. And 2014, I must preface that that was a highly rainfall year, very high in precipitation, and we think that that was one of the major problems with some of the growth in the woodland and maybe silvopasture, and it actually caused more growth, vegetative growth in the open pasture. So that was the major differences. The significant differences between all 3 were that year, 2014. 2015, we think it was more of an average year of precipitation, and there's no difference between open pasture and silvopasture in this particular study on that year. And then there was a significant difference with the woodland grazed areas, and this was the average of 3 farms. We did a survey. Also part of this was a survey of producers in the area. Practicing woodland grazing was 62%. Acres of woodland grazing looked at the different acres. So 1 to 25 acres with 34%, and then 26 to 50 was 22%, etc. What I thought was really interesting is looking at the years practicing woodland grazing. Over 20 years of practicing woodland grazing was 74%. So we do have a long history of people grazing livestock in woodlands, and the question is, how highly managed was it? And that varies certainly. So the research summary of that particular graduate study was the forage quality higher in silvopasture than woodlands, forage quantity was higher, the quality higher in the shade, and then also silvopasture was better during drought years or hot years of the summer. Forage diversity was lower in the open pastures. Woodlands had been grazed for a long time in this area and still continues to be grazed. Silvopasture and similar techniques already being adopted. And then a part of the survey, the interest in learning more about silvopasture is growing. So future research that needs to be done in most areas and even locations of different states, optimal grazing management plans, selecting appropriate stocking densities, how many livestock per acre, etc. Specific tree species for your area, specific forage species that perform best under shade, 50% shade, monitoring livestock growth and stress levels, measuring economic benefits, and measuring environmental benefits. Our second grant that we're working on presently is looking at oak savanna restorations with silvopasture. So research on silvopasture to restore historical oak savannas in the state of Minnesota, which is in the brown colored area of the state going diagonal northwest to southeast. Extension and Sustainable Farming Association in Minnesota is forming a learning network, and then also we're working together as a partnership to restore the restoration of oak savannas as a volunteer program and working with volunteers. I'm going to end on this note here of the benefits and social benefits, economical, environmental benefits of silvopasture and these biodiversity areas. So they're improving biodiversity, pollinator habitats, wildlife populations, uh, will equal healthier and better functioning, more resilient, productive ecosystems in the region. And I think that's the last slide. So I will stop sharing now.
Great. Thanks, Gary.
Yes.
And
You're
we'll
welcome.
just
Oh,
start right in with Keefe's presentation whenever he's ready.
My name is Keefe Keeley, and I am very happy to be talking with all of you about silvopasture today. Thank you, Tyler and everyone at Sustainable Farming Association for the opportunity to share some things on this webinar today. And thanks for this project generally. I think it's an excellent project, and I'm really pleased to be a part of it and sharing more knowledge and information and networking around silvopasture for Minnesota and the greater Midwest. It's a topic that's I'm very passionate about. So for those of you who aren't familiar, I help lead the Savanna Institute. We're a nonprofit organization. We do research, education, and outreach. Um, we focus on agroforestry, which Gary did a good job introducing, which silvopasture is one part of. We work across agroforestry. Silvopasture is one of my areas of emphasis personally. I come from a background of growing up on a farm in Wisconsin, studied forest ecology, and have done research in silvopasture with a lot of different on-farm projects, some of which I've had a lot of on-the-ground work, and others where I'm just helping farmers doing silvopasture with data collection and study design and that sort of thing. The photograph that you see here is one of my research sites where we converted an overgrown oak savanna to silvopasture and compared areas where we did introduce cattle and areas where we didn't, and tried a few different methods of clearing the understory and canopy and planting forages. And so this is one site where we had pretty good success, and you can see kind of in the background what it looked like before, and then after it became a pasture that was highly favored. The cattle really liked to use this area, and it was heavily invaded by buckthorn and black locust resprouts and other shrubs. And in the areas where we had seeded forages, the cattle were very effective in managing that brush so that it didn't become a thicket again. And in areas where we didn't have cattle or we didn't see those forages, the brush was much more apt to resprout and take over that process of succession again. So that's some of where I got my hands dirty or cut my teeth on this. But what I'll be talking a lot about today is to re-emphasize some of what Gary was talking about in general. What is silvopasture? And then I'll show you the outline here. Why silvopasture is of what seems to me increasing interest to many producers in the Midwest and beyond, and also people who are interested in agriculture and land use generally, even if they're not farmers themselves. And then I want to give you a few different examples of different farms across the Midwest doing silvopasture in different ways, because I think that's some of the best way to learn about the topic is what are people actually doing. And then a couple topics I want to touch on at the end are what can silvopasture do with regards to climate change, and how can we learn more about silvopasture, because obviously this is just one webinar and there's only so much we can cover here. So with that said, I want to start taking a little bit of a historical note. This is a picture from near where I come from in the driftless region of Wisconsin. This is the Black River watershed during the Dust Bowl years. And you can see the figure of a person on a horse there and some of the horrible gullies from erosion. And I want to point out that this was at a time where there was very little tractor use. And so most of this land abuse, we could say, was caused by overgrazing of livestock and draft-powered plow work. So the quote from Leopold here, I won't read it. point is that we can really only get so far in terms of um, improving land use with advanced tools. It's really about what are our value systems as well, and we'll get back to that as well. So I think silvopasture is both a tool and it can emerge from a value system that values land health and soil health, which is a part of the Sustainable Farming Association's focus on silvopasture. To repeat some of what Gary said, just to dispel these potential misconceptions, silvopasture is not any time you have trees in a pasture. One tree in a pasture causes more harm than good in most cases, I think is self-evident from these animals that are trying and failing to stay cool in the shade. And this animal that doesn't have anything to eat. And so it's really working against the purpose of trying to raise livestock to put them in a situation like this as well. So silvopasture is when we have enough light coming through the canopy that forage growth is appropriate and the trees are managed as part of the system as well. This, if you're not familiar with this system, this is the Dehesa in Spain, and also extends into the Montado in Portugal. This is a 5 million acre roughly area in that Mediterranean part of Europe where sheep and cattle and hogs are all raised on different parts of the system, the grass and the acorn mast. These are cork oak trees, and so the tree bark is also harvested for cork, like what's used in wine bottles. And this is an indigenous land use system. This has been going on for millennia in this part of the world. And we'll get back a little bit too, but I think it's worth recognizing that at one time, this is what much of the Midwest looked like. Not exactly like this, but with widely spaced oaks, with a mix of different understory, herbaceous prairie type species as well, with lots of livestock. So we'll get back to this again. Silvopasture, we'll touch on both of these ways of doing silvopasture, either putting trees into pasture or putting pasture into trees. And then again, it's about integrating the three parts, the livestock, the trees, and the forage, and managing them all as one system. So why are we interested in silvopasture? I think the place to start, and this comes from conversations with farmers, is that much of the land has this legacy of being a savanna. And this is what you'll see in a lot of woodlands in the Midwest. There are these large legacy trees that have been there for a long time, and you can see by the horizontal branches low down that the form of the tree indicates it was once open grown. In other words, it didn't have the other trees around it. And you can see the other trees around this tree are much younger. And so at one time, there was a more openness maintained by grazing, by fire. And so people are interested in silvopasture because they see that the land is suited for this type of vegetation cover and this type of use. It's also worth noting that even though a lot of livestock producers don't call it silvopasture, many of the things that are involved in silvopasture, which is again managing the trees and the forage and the livestock as a single system, they're a part of the management techniques that people are already using. So what silvopasture really does is it gives a system of thought and an approach for integrating those things. And anyone who's raising livestock on pasture in the Midwest knows that trees are a part of the vegetation that you have to manage. And the simplest thing to do is to remove them all, but many producers will leave trees or thin wooded areas strategically in order to achieve multiple objectives. The quote here shows, leaving some trees for cattle to rub up against and get flies off their backs. And we'll talk about other things besides shade being one of the most important things that people are using trees for to improve the conditions for their livestock. This is a little bit of a high concept work. It comes out of some of our research talking to farmers about how they view and use their woodlands. And the idea here is that the horizontal axis is a spectrum of, some people see their woods as something that they can get a lot of benefit from using, and that's the purpose of them. And on the other end of the spectrum, some people see the woods are something that have more intrinsic value, and they want them to be healthy, and they're not as concerned with what are these woods doing for me. And for most people, the reality is a mix of those things, but that's the spectrum. And then the vertical axis here is some people really want to be hands-on and manage their woods intensively, and other people take an attitude of, I would rather just let it be and let nature take its course. And not to say that any of these are right or wrong, this is just a spectrum of different attitudes and ways that people want to engage with their woodlands. And I think the thing to point out here is that silvopasture is going to be most appropriate for people who really want to be hands-on with their woods. And whether what you really value is what's the practical benefit that you can get from your woods, or you want your woods to be a more healthy place in terms of wildlife or carbon storage or invasive species or soil health. These things can all be managed for in silvopasture, but it really does take being hands-on. It's not a let nature take its course kind of approach. So with that sort of framework, I want to tell you some little stories or case studies about different farms doing silvopasture. This is a photograph from a field day we did last summer at Kearney Family Farm in Iowa. It's between Ames and Des Moines, roughly. And this is a farm that's an entire family affair, but led by Bruce Kearney. And I really like Bruce's his life story. He grew up on this farm. When he was a teenager, he says he cut down just about every tree on the farm and sold a lot of them as firewood so that he could buy cars and do things that teenagers like to do with a little bit of spending money. And then after a career in construction and other things, he came back to farm full-time on the farm. And he transitioned the whole farm to perennial cover. Doing crops is not really what he wanted to do, row crops that is. And he's been tree planting since 1998 when he came back to the farm. And so he's getting to the point now, after 20 odd years of that there's starting to be more tree cover now than there was even when he was a kid. And so he's really come full circle on that. And his kids are integrated, grown children working on the farm now, and grandkids there too. And so he really sees the tree planting as a really important part of the legacy for his family on that land. And you can see here in the foreground some of his more recent plantings, and in the background those are trees that planted back in the 90s, some of the first tree planting that he did. And then you can see some people standing on the swale here, and won't get into that, but that's another part of land management here. Is Bruce has been really intentional about moving water and managing the drainage on his land. And one of the things that we can do with silvopasture and perennial agriculture generally is, instead of the drain tile sort of approach of let's get water off the land as quick as possible so that we can plant our crops as early in the season as possible, how can we move the water around strategically so we don't have standing water, but the drier parts of the farm are getting water, and trees can really benefit from that. This is still at Kearney Family Farm, another parcel, a neighbor's parcel, and it's been a few years, 3 to 4 years now, that Bruce has been renting it to use it as pasture. And so, as opposed to the tree planting, which Bruce has done extensively on his family's land, this was a mostly wooded parcel. And so Bruce has made the investment in fencing and in a lot of shrub management, especially using both mechanical and chemical and biological means. So that's to say, it's involved a lot of chainsaw and brush hog work. It's involved, his son now has a goat herd, Bruce's grown son, and so the goats have had sort of first pass both before and after the mechanical. And then targeted use of herbicides are part of Bruce's management strategy as well. But he really likes to avoid that in between the goats, followed by the cattle, and once things are open enough that he can get brush hog in there or other types of mowers as well. It really doesn't take a lot of herbicide. And so this has been a win for the landowner as well. The landowner is really happy to see the land converted from a sort of degraded woodland into a more usable pasture situation. Bruce really likes having this parcel that can be a part of his rotation in the summer, especially where there's a lot of shade available, but also ample forage for the livestock. And it's also, as I mentioned, provided an opportunity for his son to manage an enterprise within the whole farming system. And so it's really been a win for a lot of different parties involved. And that's a theme here. You'll see that one of the things that silvopasture presents opportunity for, although it adds complexity, is to have multiple parties that play different roles. And because it is about integrating different parts of a whole system, sometimes having different people who have the primary responsibility of those different parts can really be advantageous, because it can be hard for us to do everything. And for many people, if you're already focused on livestock, then you may not be interested in focusing on a new tree crop. So, and we'll talk about some more of those arrangements as well. This is Greg Judy of Green Pastures Farm. It farms along with his wife, and usually several other partners as interns, or who have enterprises that are interlinked. If you're not familiar with Greg and his work, I recommend learning more. I've learned a lot from Greg personally, and I know a lot of people have. He's written a number of books, including No Risk Ranching, and is really a leader in the management intensive rotational grazing community. And part of Greg's story is figuring out how he could manage other people's cattle on other people's land and make a living doing it without having a lot of his own capital tied up. And that was really how Greg got his start, or started trying to farm more conventional ways, and was going broke doing it. And so restarted under this model, and really found that the landowners that he was leasing from were really happy when Greg started doing silvopasture establishment on some of the wooded acres. And he leases about 1,600 acres of land now for his cattle herd, and he has other livestock as well. About 900 acres of that is in woodland. And so from a very practical point of view, Greg is interested in, if he's leasing 1,600 acres, he would like to be able to use more of that as pasture. And he's also engaged in some forestry enterprises, but that's a primary objective for him, is to have more pasture available for his livestock. And instead of just clearing that woodland and having open pasture, Greg has been very pioneering and working with the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri in strategically leaving trees behind that are going to both benefit his livestock in having more shade available, and also increase in timber value. So using forestry techniques such as crop tree management, where the trees that are just entering their prime and are the highest potential timber value, instead of being cut and sold now, are released in the same way that if seedlings in your garden, when you weed, you release them and give them more space to grow. The same thing works for trees. And so foresters call this crop tree management, where they identify the crop trees that they want to leave, and then cull the trees around them. And this is in contrast to what's commonly done in a lot of irresponsible forestry, where it's take the best and leave the rest, which really leaves woodlands degraded and of much lower timber value. And for those of you who do livestock, you can imagine what your herd would look like if you took that approach of every year you culled the best and left the rest. And so the same holds true for trees, both on a standing timber level, but also on the genetic makeup and the species composition of what's in your woodlands. So Greg's been leaving behind the high value trees, and with another 10, 15, 20 years, the value of those trees in timber markets, it just climbs exponentially. And so it's really worth the time there. And the other thing that Greg has done is he's added enterprises with those trees that he's culled. And one of the big ones is mushroom cultivation. Greg grows a number of different types of mushrooms, but especially shiitake grow well on the oak logs that he's culling. And he has some pretty substantial markets for those mushrooms as well. And so that's something that silvopasture presents opportunity for as well, is finding additional uses of the potentially economically valuable parts of your farm while improving the ecological condition. The other thing I'll mention about Greg is we don't have as much of this in Minnesota in the upper Midwest, but some of the trees that get a bad name there, he's found can be really beneficial for his livestock, specifically honey locust, which mast a very nutritious pod. And he sees a lot of benefit in his livestock having that as a supplementary source of forage, and is not as concerned with the thorns associated with that tree as some other people are. There's a lot of great videos of Greg talking about his work out on the internet. Some of them are on our website, savannainstitute.org. And so encourage you to check that out and learn more from Greg. Another farm here is the Bratzett family farm and Farrell farm in Wisconsin. This is another partnership between a landowner and a farmer. In this case, the landowner, Kirsten on the left, she raises a cow-calf beef herd and direct markets steers. And she's been interested in agroforestry and silvopasture, but was fully occupied with running the rest of her farm and an off-farm job. Got to know Casey on the right, who was interested in raising tree crops, especially chestnuts. And so they made an agreement that in one of the hay fields on Kirsten's farm, Casey would plant rows of chestnuts. And Casey just leased the actual space for the chestnuts. He didn't lease this whole field. And Kirsten continues to make hay in between those rows of trees. So this is an agroforestry technique known as alley cropping. And it's worked well for them because Kirsten is very happy to see this happening on her farm, but she doesn't have to be the one managing it. And she doesn't lose that much hay ground either. So she continues to make hay, and that's a benefit for Casey in that it reduces the mowing and the land lease cost for him as well. As the system matures, and this is a photo from a few years ago now, so that the trees are already quite a bit taller. The idea is that once the trees are tall enough that this can become a silvopasture. And so one thing to point out here is that when you're planting trees, one way to start it out is to start with an alley cropping setup. And then when the trees are mature enough, then introduce livestock back into that area. I won't say any more about that, but it's been a great working relationship and another example of silvopasture via a multi-party partnership. This is another example of a multi-party arrangement, Vulcan Farm in Illinois. In this case, the landowner raises sheep and was also interested in having tree crops on her land and in having more shade for her animals specifically. And so she found farmer Kevin Wolz, who also works with us at the Savanna Institute, but he manages this farm in Illinois. And so Kevin does the trees, and Kathy's sheep get the benefit of the shade. And there's a lot of details that they worked out, and I won't get into all of them, but I'll just point out one as an example of how you can customize these arrangements to specific situations and contexts and needs. In planting the trees, Kathy was happy to pay for the cost of trees that would provide shade, but because she was going to maintain ownership of those trees when the lease runs out. But the trees that Kevin wanted to plant are improved varieties where they're either grafted or they're otherwise selected cultivars, and they cost more, but it's the example of an apple tree. You can plant an apple rootstock for $1 a tree, say, but if you want a Honeycrisp or an improved apple variety that's not just going to give you crab apples, then you pay more for it. So it wasn't mostly apples in this case, but Kevin paid that additional cost beyond the rootstock cost for the cost of having tree crops rather than just trees for shade. And so they customized that arrangement, and they have a long-term lease. And I'll point out too that using some of these examples, we have on our website as well a long-term lease workbook. And that's a guide for landowners and farmers who want to form agroforestry partnerships that walks through what are the questions to ask, what are the steps to go through, and has some templates and models for setting up these long-term lease arrangements. So I think it's a great model, and it can be adapted to a lot of situations. At the same farm, they've also introduced chickens as a part of the livestock in these tree crop systems. Here's the chickens in a willow stand, a windbreak, which they really like. Many of you in Minnesota may be familiar with the work of Reginaldo Haslett-Marroquin and Main Street Project and regeneration farms around poultry-centered agroforestry systems. And especially for young trees, this can be a great model. And to point out that chickens especially are really adapted to having a canopy overhead is the habitat that they prefer naturally. And so they're great candidates for silvopasture systems. I won't go into detail on that, but pointing out that this is another avenue for silvopasture. Another farm here presents an interesting case, Humble Hands Harvest in the Decorah area of Iowa. These farmers formed their farm as a worker-owned cooperative, which is a little bit different business model than a lot of your usual LLC type models for a farm business. They have a variety of reasons for doing that. Part of it is that their farm they really see as a community asset, and they've been able to raise funding from their community in part as an alternative to a large CAFO operation that was looking to come into the area. And so the community, as an alternative to that as a land use, bought the site where this farm is, and the community invested in the long-term tree crops. They planted with community funding a lot of tree crops, nut trees on this farm. And those trees are held in trust, essentially owned by the community. And the farmers here shown are managing those trees as a part of their lease payment, essentially, for the land. And they're also building equity into owning that land, or their cooperative businesses. And in between those trees, they're both raising alley crop vegetables, and they have areas where they're doing pastured pigs as well. And so a mix of silvopasture and alley cropping. And so again, another application of silvopasture, but also of these multi-party arrangements. And it's perfectly possible, to do silvopasture on your own. But again, I think there's an opportunity, especially as we look at the larger trends and challenges of having land that's largely owned by an older generation, and a dire need for entry points for beginning farmers, and especially younger farmers that don't have equity or capital to bring to it. So I think this is a good opportunity to try to address that issue along with the ecological issues we're looking at. We have another study of 4 farms here that we did at the Savanna Institute that looked at specifically different strategies for planting trees in pasture and different ways of protecting them, from different types of fencing to tree tubes to other things, and how that works with different livestock as well, from cattle to sheep to different types of poultry and hogs, and did that on different farms in different parts of the Midwest. So I won't go into the details here, but we have a report on that, as well as some podcast interviews with these farmers on our website as well. So if you want more information on that, I encourage you to get in touch with that. As sort of concluding our tour of silvopasture in the Midwest here, I want to point out, kind of go back to the historical context of this, which I think the way I think of history is not as something that's in the past, but really how we got to the point where we are today and where we're going in the future. This is a photograph of Fort Atkinson, Iowa, which is the name of the town, as well as the name of this historical site, which was a military fort where the people from the Ho-Chunk tribe in Wisconsin were removed across the Mississippi and held here under the auspices of protecting them from being attacked by other tribes in Minnesota, but also preventing them from returning to their homelands. And I just stumbled upon this site returning from the field day I mentioned that we did at the Kearney family farm in Iowa as I was driving back to Wisconsin. And it really brought home to me what it meant that this landscape really was managed as silvopasture, not by those words, but managed, the use of fire was really for a lot of reasons, but especially to improve the forage for the wild game that were an important part of the food system for the original inhabitants of this land. And on that same trip, I drove by, this is called Battle Bluff, which is the site where Blackhawks band was trying to escape the militias who were pursuing it. And this was in I'm forgetting the date now. I could read the historical marker here, but it was really right before Western Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa were settled. And it was one of the last sort of conflicts between Native people and white settlers here. And it was really it's called a battle, but it's also called a massacre by many, because many of the tribal people who were fleeing were killed or drowned trying to cross the Mississippi. And that's both also to give context for this historically, but what's to me really striking about this photograph is that the trees in the foreground just behind the historical marker here are all honey locust. And honey locust is a species in particular interest to silvopasture, and a lot of value for a variety of reasons. It makes a great pasture tree, filtered shade. It's a legume, although it's not clear how much nitrogen it fixes, but the pods are very nutritious. And it's a tree that was moved around extensively by Native peoples in North America. And there have been sort of archaeological studies that have shown the distribution of honey locust is not what you'd expect from sort of natural distribution, but it's very concentrated in areas where there's also evidence of longstanding habitation by people. And so it's no accident that as we try to figure out what's right to do by the land in this region, we're also faced increasingly, I think, with the question of what's right to do by the people of this land. And I think we have to think about that. It includes us from settler communities as well as indigenous inhabitants who are not just history, but many of whom are still here. And I think this is part of what Aldo Leopold was talking about when he highlighted that land is not just for what it yields us in terms of marketable crops, but for the culture it builds for our society as well. And so I think silvopasture is about more than just what are the economic implications or ecological implications of what we do with our land. So with that, I'll pivot in just a few minutes here to one of the other great questions of our time, climate change. Silvopasture has gotten a lot of attention for what it might do to help us solve climate change. This is a global figure that shows the more red colors here are farmland where there's very little carbon stored in biomass. In other words, trees are made out of biomass, and much of that biomass is carbon. That's what trees and other plants do through photosynthesis, is take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into their bodies and pump it into the soil. And this shows that in some parts of the world, especially the tropics, you can keep a lot of carbon sequestered in the actual biomass, not just in the soil, but in the trees and other perennial vegetation. So the red in the Midwest shows that we have the potential to turn to blue and store a lot of carbon here. And that plays out in a lot of data sets. This is data from the USDA showing that at the top of the list here, forestation, which is adding trees to cropland or pasture, can sequester a lot of carbon. And then at the bottom of this list, grazing management can also sequester a lot of carbon. And so when we put those two together with silvopasture, we have a powerful tool for sequestering carbon. Now I should point out and emphasize that when we're removing trees from an overgrown woodland, that's a different situation than tree planting, which is what these data are considering. I think that there's no doubt that removing trees is going to remove carbon, but that's in the near term. And I think there are longer term implications of having healthy ecosystems with healthy regeneration in the long term, which should be a part of silvopasture management. And so although the carbon balance is not going to be favorable on cutting trees to implement silvopasture, if the long-term focus is on improving ecosystem health and having a plan for tree regeneration, I think that letting forests turn into buckthorn thickets is also not very good for carbon sequestration. So it all has to be taken on balance. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to plant trees for silvopasture as well. And so this is the Comet Planner from the USDA as well, a powerful tool to show to any NRCS agent that you're trying to get cost share funding from, to show them that you can sequester a lot more carbon with silvopasture than you can from just prescribed grazing or tillage adjustments or cover crops. The Project Drawdown took a global look at all solutions to climate change, and silvopasture made the top 10, along here with other things that don't have anything to do with agriculture. It's really beyond a plant-rich diet and food waste, which are more food system than agriculture. Silvopasture was the only agricultural solution in terms of solutions to climate change in this list. So just to highlight a few other resources and communities, if you want to go beyond this webinar series, Savanna Institute, along with University of Wisconsin Extension and Minnesota Extension, including Gary and Giomi, have been doing silvopasture camps, we've called them, which are basically workshops and field days for the last number of years. This is a photograph from one of them. Diane, who's been a key part of that, is with UW Extension. Her dissertation defense on silvopasture is actually on Monday. And so you can, probably hard to jot down this web link here if you want to find out about that, but you can also contact me. My contact information is on our website if you'd like a link to that dissertation defense, which includes both the social aspect of learning about silvopasture as well as field trials in Wisconsin. Lots of more opportunities for information. I've mentioned a few on our Savanna Institute website. And events are a little bit of a question mark now in the age of COVID, but we're going to do some virtual field days, planning that in the works. And then we have existing media on our website as well, which I encourage you to peruse. I'll also highlight the Facebook group, Silvopasture, which is a great place to ask questions and to find lots of information from people doing silvopasture and interested in the topic. This will have to be once the webinar is published. You can go back to this list and see there's a lot of links here, or again, contact me, different places you can read for more information about silvopasture. The top one here I'll point out is a webinar that I did back in January of this year, I believe, or maybe it was March. Anyway, that was more in-depth, talking about the actual practice of going into a woodland and assessing the site and planning the steps to convert that to silvopasture. So a deeper dive on the actual nuts and bolts of doing silvopasture in that webinar. So we didn't get into that today, but that's there if you want to see that recorded webinar. I'll also highlight Steve's book. This is a great read. There's a lot of excellent information here, as well as framing silvopasture generally. One thing I really learned from Steve and from this book is rather than looking at managing silvopasture for forest products, Steve really thinks about what are the trees we can add to our pasture systems that are going to add value for the livestock themselves. And so he highlights species in the poplar, willow, black locust, and mulberry groups as having the potential to both add forage value and shade value, being really vigorous, easy to plant and establish, quick to grow, and inexpensive. Black locust, I want to put a strong asterisk next to. That can be very invasive and problematic in many areas, but in other areas where it's already established, especially, it can be managed appropriately. So I highly recommend this book. Also, Steve has a great series of webinars too, if you can access through Cornell Extension. And then Planting Tree Crops includes a chapter on livestock integration. This is a Savanna Institute publication, available free download on our website, or we can ship you a book. Just want to highlight that. So that's all that I have. Thanks all for your attention, and look forward to a little bit of Q&A here with the time that we have left.
Yeah, thanks, Keefe. We got about 20 minutes here. Wayne, let's jump right in.
Okay, here's the first one. Why so little known of bison east of the Mississippi?
You know, this is Gary. As I was growing up too, I just thought the bison were in the Great Plains, And I just looked on a couple websites, and there's a wood bison, eastern wood bison, recorded in Pennsylvania and New York. You may want to contact your natural historical museums in your area and see what they have for documentation of native bison in your states on the eastern border there. But yeah, I think maybe the books, early books in the study that we've grown up with didn't have that in there. But it sounds like through the museums and so forth, you should find more information.
Okay. Next question, are there any special considerations for silvopasture in areas with sinkholes and karst regions?
This is Gary again. I don't know if that's from Minnesota or not. We do have karst topography in the southeastern part of Minnesota. And I think if you go into your NRCS or SWCD office, that's Soil Water Conservation District office or Natural Resources Conservation Service, those types of regions that do have those geographic locations of karst topography or sinkholes do have some federal programmings and maybe some even state funding of those landscapes that might be beneficial for you. I know EQIP is available in those areas of the state, and you just have to work with those types of agencies for funding. And then, yeah, and it's a different resource to work with, but do seek those particular agencies out.
I can point out one consideration for those areas. The slide that I started with, you saw the Oak Savanna area that we had cleared for silvopasture. It took some machinery and some intensive livestock use to do that, and that was on sort of a ridge top that was a fairly thin soil on top of a limestone, and I don't know whether there were sinkholes or karst there, but that's common for those type of areas, that the topsoil tends to be fairly thin where the bedrock is closer to the surface. And in those areas, especially where you have large mature trees like that, if there hasn't been livestock use, those root systems are having to support a fairly large amount of leaf area. And so when you compact the soil through any action, that reduces the ability of those roots to have the air that they need to be healthy and to uptake the water that they need to supply all that leaf area. And so where you have thin soil or soil that's very vulnerable to compaction, if it's wet, that's another area like that, or heavy clay soils, those areas can really make it hard on the roots of those trees, especially large canopied mature trees. Younger trees that have more time to sort of adapt to that use can grow into it. But that's one consideration that you need to be careful of. And we did unfortunately see some pretty significant dieback in some of those areas. And it wasn't clear if it was just because of the cattle, because we also saw dieback in areas where we didn't have cattle and where we didn't have machinery, but just on the sort of principles of how trees and tree roots work in the soil. Compaction is really one of the reasons why rotational grazing and being attentive to what's the condition of the soil when you're introducing livestock is really important in silvopasture systems.
Okay, excellent. Another question on where do we find resources for cover crops between the trees for grazing in our region?
This is Gary. I think your agency, state and federal, like SWCDs or NRCS, would have programs that would cover that, and they would have actually the mixes that are eligible for those programs. Other farmers that have different cover crops, I know with FSA in Minnesota, we have several case study bulletins that our Sustainable Farming Association has put together with farmers that do cover crops and talk about their operations, and actually have websites and emails and phone numbers to contact them on what they do. So that learning from farm to farmer is very, very good. And then if you can find a farmer that's doing that practice with cover crops around your area, that would be good to know, and then learn from them and what they're using.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Gary. I'll add that there aren't a lot of great data on which cover crops or forages generally do well in somewhat shaded conditions. But we do know that orchard grass is one great grass for partial shade. It's right in the name, orchard. It does well there. And then on the forb and legume side, clovers can do pretty well, both white and red and other types of clover. Um, and there are others as well. I really think taking a cocktail sort of approach where you're putting a lot of diversity out there is your best bet, because it's hard to know site to site what's actually going to do well. Try what has already worked on your site and see what's going to also work well in shaded conditions. And I don't know, maybe Tyler, I don't know if you want to say anything. You've done, I think, if I understand, some seeding in your tree planting. Can you say what's worked well in your part of Minnesota? If that's fair to call on you.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say quickly that we planted into what were ag fields. They were corn the year before. And so we planted perennial pasture first. We didn't use any annuals or cover crops. And we just planted a fairly high diversity mix of grasses and legumes. Cool season introduced plants, sort of a typical, open pasture mix for Minnesota. And then planted trees the same spring, just a couple weeks later, right into the same field.
Okay. Yeah, I'll add that oats or an annual rye can make for a nice nurse crop, which also kind of functions as a cover crop. In a new planting, especially if you want to get livestock in there, but also just for weed suppression, having something that can cover the bare ground quickly and be a nurse for some of those longer lived forages can be helpful too.
Okay, I see that there was a comment that they put a question in the chat box, and I think Teresa Keeley would like to answer that question live.
The question is, thanks for acknowledging the history of the land and the work of Indigenous folks with old living knowledge, including Rahe at the Main Street Project. Are there any other efforts you're seeing to amplify Native knowledge in forest and animal management? And then she also noted that All Our Relations by Winona LaDuke has great history of bison here in Minnesota. So amplifying Native knowledge in forest and animal management. Who wants to field that?
I can just point to Steve Gabriel again. He touches on some of that in his book, and I also know through his work on his farm as well, putting the sort of historical view and indigenous land use view on silvopasture. So I think that's a good place to start. Beyond that, I can't think of, I think Winona LaDuke is a good suggestion as well in this region, but I can't think of anything else besides that.
We have a couple of extension educators that are Native Americans in Minnesota. Shirley Norbren from the Cloquet area or Duluth area comes to mind. But yeah, it's a good question. We probably need to use more of those resources to educate people about the history of both forest management and animal management.
Very good. Here's a question on where do we find good information on tree spacing for rotational grazing between rows. This person is looking at chestnuts planted 30 feet apart. Is this enough space for light, grass growth, fencing, etc.?
If you're interested in chestnuts, I always refer people to Tom Wall down at Southeastern Iowa that is in the Red Fern Farm Nursery, and he sells chestnuts. I'm not sure what the spacing is recommended. I think he recommends a spacing of 25 feet, but it's certainly up to the landowner of what spacing they'd like. Yeah, I'd refer to that resource. Actually, I think the Practical Farmers of Iowa had a chestnut symposium with Tom Wall and other resource people. In fact, Michael Gold from the Agroforestry Center came up to that, I think in Iowa. Was it last year or 2 years ago? That's recorded in the Practical Farmers of Iowa information and also on his website.
Yeah, I'll just add that Tom Wall and Kathy Dice at Redfern are also raising sheep and with their chestnuts. The spacing between trees in the row is going to, depend on the trees themselves, but the spacing between the rows where you might use that for livestock really depends on the livestock. And For cattle, you really don't want too narrow of an alley, or it just doesn't work. They get too bunched up. But for other livestock, 30 feet might be just fine. And I'll add, in addition to the livestock, you also want to think about what other type of access you need between those tree rows. If you're going to be cutting it for hay or have other machinery, you need to have ample room, properly spaced to fit that machinery in there. So it really depends on what livestock and what machinery to think about how far apart your tree rows should be for silvopasture.
There's a question again on bison. Is the wood bison different from the prairie bison?
Yes, I think that's a correct, yes, the answer is yes.
I'm going to ask a couple of related questions. One is, how is fire currently used in silvopasture? And another is there further discussion or studies on the use of fire in silvopasture management?
I can take a first swing at that. I'm not aware of studies like that. I would love to be a part of such studies. And so if anybody's going to do that, please reach out to me. I'd love to talk with you about it and maybe help document what you find and share it with other people. I think there's great potential for that. In managed grazing systems, you may be familiar with what's called patch burn grazing, which is a system used in the Flint Hills and other parts, even in Iowa, where prairie systems are burned seasonally, and then following a period of regrowth, several weeks or a month or two, when it's appropriate, then the livestock are rotated in, usually just for a few days, and that's the only time that area is grazed that year. So it's a long return rotation, but the livestock can really gain well on that flush following the fire, and so it integrates the use of fire with managing that pasture system. I think, especially because in establishing woodland silvopasture, the duff and leaf litter layer can be difficult unless you have a good no-till drill to get your forage established. Fire can be a way to get the soil exposed so you can get seed to soil contact, as well as ongoing management. And there are studies as well of using fire for the purposes of oak regeneration. I won't get into the details on that, but I think that's another field of study that could interface with thinking about the use of fire in silvopasture management.
Okay. Why are elms considered less desirable? Is that because of Dutch elm disease or some other reason?
Yes, I assume that's the cause. Elms don't live very long in Minnesota. They reach a certain height and diameter, and then they die from the Dutch elm disease. There are Dutch elm disease resistant varieties that urban foresters are using in communities or towns. You certainly can use those in rural areas as well. If you'd like to use that, you can contact me. We have some information on our website.
Yeah, I'll just add that what's desirable is really a matter of what the goals and objectives of the landowner or land manager are. And so, usually forestry is kind of the first filter for this. And so you're looking at timber value. And like Gary says, elms generally just don't live long enough to have any timber value. But those younger elms can still have wildlife value, and they can have firewood value, and if the stump resprouts, can have forage value. And so they might not have a lot of value as a canopy component, although if you just need shade, they do just fine. But they can still be managed for value within a pasture system. So desirable, again, is based on what are you desiring it for.
Okay. There's a note that came in that the Minnesota NRCS Agricultural Technical Note number 31 has a table of 24 characteristics of common grass, legume, and forb species, including their shade tolerance. So that was just some information that I wanted to get shared. So, Gary, you mentioned that you are studying the effects on wildlife with silvopasture. What are some of your efforts that you're doing on that?
Well, this is be on our study in the Savanna region that we're currently studying. We have a wildlife specialist, John Lorgering, out of the University of Minnesota Crookston office, and we'll be studying birds and mammals. And actually, you just talked about the other day about a bat type of detection sonar that will detect bats in the woodlands. So we're just starting that research in the Oak Savanna region in the middle part of the state of Minnesota.
Good. Okay, that's all the questions that have come in.
There was someone asking for a digital copy of the charts, especially those with websites or book titles. After the 21st of this month, we will send an email out to everyone who registered for the whole series, and we will have each of the webinars available for you online. And so you can expect to receive that. So you'll get all of the recordings of all of them, and I think that should work.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for questions. We have a few minutes to wrap up with a couple final slides. And then Jeff Jackson is going to kick off our final slide here.
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, my name is Jeff Jackson. I'm an extension educator like Gary Wyatt for the University of Minnesota, and talk to you for just a minute or two about the Silvopasture Learning Network. And Gary's referred to this project already. It comes from a Minnesota LCCMR grant. It's a partnership between U of M Extension, Sustainable Farming Association, the Minnesota DNR, and Great River Greening. And so part of that grant, we're doing research at the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, looking at how could silvopasture work for oak savanna restoration, because traditionally large animals grazing in that type of habitat is what kept it healthy. And so we're doing some cattle silvopasture grazing experiments at Sherburne. And then part of the grant is for education, and that's where the Silvopasture Learning Network comes in. And I like how Keefe referred to this as a learning community. So what we're all about is building knowledge and relationships, really building a community for the successful silvopasture and oak savanna restoration. So we've got a website that's listed here on the slide, and we're building up knowledge products on the website and other resources for you to use, contact information. And then also we're building up an email list, and with the survey you'll be receiving, please opt in to sign up for emails regarding the Silvopasture Learning Network. We'll send you information on field days when we can begin those again after some of the pandemic concerns, volunteer events that we're planning, webinars, and cafe chats. So we'd love to have you be a part of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And the last thing we'd like to plug today is the location of SFA's silvopasture resources. The website is there on the slide, and that is a location where you will find these webinars and other future webinars and or videos or whatever content we create in the next year or two. And you'll also find the recently produced resource manual that serves as a guide to start off on gathering more information about silvopasture. Whether you're a farmer or a forester or a resource professional, there's great information there, as well as individual contacts and organizations that can help get you on the right track with whatever your goals are surrounding silvopasture. You'll also find future events relating to SFA, SFA's silvopasture programming, and that's kind of the one-stop shop for our content. And you'll find also my contact information below. If you're looking for more information, you can reach out to me via email or phone there. And with that, that concludes our webinar. I thank Gary and Keefe for your presentations, and thanks to everyone else on the panel and in the audience for joining us today, and hope to see some of you again next week on Tuesday for our producer panel webinar.